Hello and welcome to a short presentation about the Wood Buffalo National Park World Heritage Site in Northern Canada and the efforts of the Mikisew Cree First Nation to protect it. I'm Mark Gustafson. I'm the project lead for Mikisew's efforts to engage in World Heritage processes to ensure that the threats to the park are resolved so that the community can continue to utilize the park to support their way of life. Wood Buffalo National Park is a very interesting case of how developments outside of World Heritage boundaries can have drastic impacts on OUV and biodiversity. In many ways, Wood Buffalo is an extreme example because the upstream developments are so massive in scale and have been operating for decades. These include large oil sands mines in Alberta's oil sands area and multiple large hydroelectric projects on the Peace River, a major tributary into the park. Now the pressures of climate change on a boreal ecosystem are increasing and adding to those impacts. From a corrective action perspective, Wood Buffalo is also interesting because World Heritage scrutiny has been prompted by an Indigenous community from the property, the Mikisew Cree First Nation. Presentation will have three areas. The first will be to provide some context. The second will be to describe current initiatives to address the threats to the park. And I'll end with some observations from Mikisew's experience, usually using the World Heritage Committee processes over the last 7 years. In many ways, Wood Buffalo National Park should be a success story. It's an exceptionally large park at 4.5 million hectares and is located in a fairly remote place of Canada. To give you a sense of that, Fort Chipewyan, which you can see on the edge of the park and on the edge of Lake Athabasca, is only accessible by plane during many months of the year, with road access only being possible in the winter when winter roads are developed. A couple of features of this map to note that'll be helpful for the rest of the presentation. South of Wood Buffalo National Park, you see the gray polygon, which is where bitumen is extracted through open pit mining. You'll also see the Athabasca River there, which runs south to north and flows through the mineable oil sands area. West of the park, you see the Peace River, which flows from British Columbia into the Delta and is one of the major tributaries for the Peace Athabasca Delta. You'll also see on the west side there, 3 dams on the Peace River, the Bennett Dam, Peace Canyon Dam, and the Site C hydroelectric project, which are a major cause of some of the concerns with the park. Wood Buffalo National Park is an exceptional area. The Peace Athabasca Delta is the largest inland boreal delta in the world. It was described by the reactive monitoring mission that took place in 2016 as the disproportionate heart of the property. The park also supports habitat of the endangered whooping crane, and there's an unbroken relationship between wolves and wood bison in the park that is unique. The park also supports large concentrations of migratory waterfowl. Who are the Mikisew Cree First Nation? Mikisew are an Indigenous community with approximately 3,000 citizens. While its administrative center is Fort Chipewyan, its traditional territory covers the full extent of the Peace Athabasca Delta and down into the oil sands area. Mikisew members continue to rely on traditional activities for their livelihood and for their cultural and spiritual activities. And the park is central to the Mikisew way of life. To give you a sense of the importance of the Delta for Mikisew cultural and social well-being, there's a quote on this slide, portions of which I'll read to you. The Delta, which is called Ayapaska in Cree, is precious to us. It is our home, our grocery store, our classroom, our church, our highway, and our photo album. The Delta informs our thinking, how we think and how we see the world. That comes from the Delta. As Mikisew people, it is the place where our happiest memories live. And there's a phrase by the Mikisew, Nipitapitam in Cree, which is water is boss, which reflects just how important water in the Delta is to the Mikisew, but also how important water is to the life of the Delta itself. Threats to Wood Buffalo National Park fall in 3 general areas: upstream industrial activities, climate change, and governance deficiencies. Industrial development, there's really two main drivers of threats to the park. The first associated with oil sands industries. Oil sands projects use massive amounts of water, which is withdrawn from the Athabasca River, which can negatively impact that river's relationship with the Peace River and contribute to drying trends in the Delta. Oil sands are also associated with a variety of contamination concerns from tailings ponds, many of which are located directly adjacent to the river, as well as other ways for contaminants to get into the system, melting of snowpack, air deposition, etc. Mikisew members have been finding deformed fish for quite some time in the Delta and in the rivers, which appear to be linked to oil sands. There's also a rare cancer cluster in the community that may be linked to oil sands sources. The dams on the Peace River have been operating for decades. Government scientists have shown how the introduction of the dams has altered the flow regime on the Peace River in a way that has impaired the natural flooding and recharge mechanisms of the Delta, which is exacerbating drying trends in the area. Climate change is a significant concern as well, with parts of the recharge mechanisms for the pad being dependent on ice jamming, melting of snowpack, and other factors that are exceptionally vulnerable to climate change. The industrial developments that I've just described exist in an exceptionally problematic governance context. A good example is the land use planning process for the area south of the park and directly adjacent to the park was undertaken by the provincial government with the express purpose of facilitating growth of oil sands production, and didn't include any consideration of that, the health of the park, health of the Delta when that land use plan was being developed. Cumulative effect management programs abound in the region, but are typically short-lived, best described as window dressing, and are largely disconnected from any decision-making relating to the health of the park. In addition, in the last decade, we've seen a troubling deregulation trend, which has resulted in more oil sands projects being evaluated without any consideration of downstream effects into the park. What does this mean in practice? It means the Delta is drying, it means water quality concerns are increasing, and it means an overall loss of biodiversity. For the Mikisew, some of these concerns are particularly acute. For a community that used to have its members dip water in cups into the Lake Claire for drink water, they now have to take hundreds of pounds of water when they want to go into the park for harvesting activities. Access concerns are growing. Mikisew can only get into the Delta by boat, and with water levels decreasing, that's becoming increasingly unsafe or impossible. You can see from the picture on this slide, a Mikisew member having to pull a boat which has gotten stuck because water levels are so low. Here's a quote from a Mikisew elder. When you go into the lake there and it's dry or the water is low in the middle over there, you know, you feel lonely, like you've got a sad feeling, you know. I don't know how to explain it, but it don't feel good anyways. You know, you feel lonely, like you lost something important. So what's being done to address this very problematic and sobering context? Prior to 2014, when Mikisew submitted its petition to the committee asking that Wood Buffalo National Park be inscribed on the list of World Heritage Sites in danger, the answer was simple: nothing. Domestic efforts by Mikisew at negotiation with governments, participating in regulatory processes, and various forms of litigation all yielded roughly the same result. Wood Buffalo National Park was out of sight and out of mind when it came to approval of industrial projects. Corrective actions were non-existent, and monitoring was limited or uncoordinated and disconnected from decision-making processes. Following Mikisew's petition and the release of a reactive monitoring mission report, that was requested by the committee, the story has started to change. The state party has undertaken a variety of initiatives to address the findings of the the reactive monitoring mission and subsequent World Heritage decisions. Canada undertook a strategic environmental assessment, which confirmed the findings of the mission report and determined that core aspects of the park are not meeting desired outcomes and that trends are negative, particularly around the Peace Athabasca Delta. This wasn't a surprise to the Mikisew, but it was a major turning point to have the state party acknowledge these concerns. An action plan was developed in 2019 to respond to the recommendations of the reactive monitoring mission. It has 142 actions included within it, with the vast majority of those being focused around environmental flows and hydrology, monitoring and science, and improving Indigenous partnerships. Canada has started reinvesting in the park after massive cuts from the previous federal government. Most recently, approximately $60 million was over a 3-year period was announced in last December, so December of 2020. Early work on the action plan has started. I'll describe some of the challenges in a moment, but it is noteworthy that a variety of working groups have been established to further evaluate how to approach corrective actions, and some work such as early work on designing water controlled structures that could be put in the Delta to facilitate efforts to address drying trends have started. In Mikisew's view, without World Heritage scrutiny and without the reactive monitoring mission, it's unlikely that any of these efforts would have been initiated. The decision from the World Heritage Committee this summer highlights that we aren't out of the woods yet, despite the allocation of new resources, despite the existence of the action plan. Oil sands mines are continuing to be approved without consideration of threats and impacts to the pad in the regulatory processes for those projects. Site C dam construction has continued without some of the requested assessments by the committee around the flow regime for the river. We're seeing new actions outside of the action plan which pose a risk to the park. A good example is the federal government has initiated a process to develop a regulatory framework for the first time that would allow the release of oil sands processed affected waters into the Athabasca River. In short, the link between industrial developments and the action plan is still unclear. Additional concerns relate to governance. Parks Canada is the lead for the action plan, but it doesn't have a mandate or legislative tools to require that other departments or other jurisdictions do their part. There are governance challenges when it comes to water governance in particular, as well as broader coordination for the action plan. Canada's efforts to create better partnerships with Indigenous communities and to ensure that they have a real role in decision-making around the action plan and upstream development are in a nascent stage. And while $60 million may sound like a lot, many actions will require ongoing support or take place after the 3-year funding window expires. And so a permanent funding mechanism is something that is still very much needed. I'd like to spend a bit of time turning back the focus on Mikisew. So what is Mikisew's role in all of this? Mikisew has been actively participating in World Heritage processes, as I mentioned, starting with the formal petition in 2014, but has continued through direct outreach to committee members and providing information to advisory bodies to assist with their analysis. Most recently, the 3 Indigenous communities of the Peace Athabasca Delta jointly authored what they called an Indigenous State of Conservation report to go alongside the state party's State of Conservation report. Mikisew has also been working directly with the state party on implementation efforts for the action plan. Mikisew participates in a number of the task teams to try and ensure that traditional knowledge is taken into account and community objectives are taken into account. That's complemented by efforts to engage directly with senior officials within Parks Canada, Environment Canada, and with the Environment Minister federally, with the objective of all that being to ensure there's more accountability and better processes in place around corrective actions. Mikisew hasn't been content to leave everything up to governments and has been proactive in trying to advance with its own solutions. A good example here is Mikisew led a coalition with industry and government to advance the creation of a new conservation complex along the southern boundary of the park to address some of the threats associated with oil sands industries. The result has been quite successful. There's a 300,000 hectare new conservation area along the southern boundary of Wood Buffalo National Park, the Kataskanou-Niuanene Wildland Park that was driven by the Mikisew Cree First Nation. Because of experiences with government-led monitoring, Mikisew has also brought the other Indigenous communities of the pad together to design what they're calling the Peace Athabasca Institute as the preferred mechanism for responding to committee requests around monitoring and science and linking monitoring more effectively to upstream decision-making. There's also been a campaign aspect of Mikisew's efforts. Mikisew has been very fortunate to have support of dozens of civil society organizations like the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, which has helped to elevate the profile of the issues, particularly domestically. I'd like to spend a little bit of time providing some thoughts on what has worked from Mikisew's perspective. First and foremost, the filing of the formal petition with the committee back in 2014 really was a game changer for the park. Another thing that has been important and has been successful is Mikisew has allocated a lot of time and energy and resources to ensuring that it has some of the best available information that it can provide to the advisory bodies and to committee members so that they have a more fulsome understanding of what threats are, but also what the reality is around efforts to address threats. Mikisew has found that it's been very important to have people see what's happening with the park rather than just read about it in reports. Domestically, that's involved bringing government officials to the Delta to go into the Delta with Mikisew elders to see the issues firsthand. At the committee level, it's involved creating video materials so that committee members and others can see what's happening with their own eyes, but also see how it's important to Mikisew members. Mikisew has invested a lot of resources in being present at World Heritage Committee meetings and with trying to meet with committee members directly and also advisory bodies so that folks have an opportunity to see the passion of Mikisew, but also to be able to ask questions of Mikisew to get information in real time. It's been very clear that World Heritage Committee decisions do matter, and in many ways that's been part of the success story from Mikisew's perspective. The committee has, since the filing of the petition, provided very clear direction to the state party and articulated very clearly where its concerns are around threats, but also where Canada needs to do more to address those threats. And each decision by the World Heritage Committee has created important moments for the state party to work with Mikisew to determine how best to course correct, increase efforts, modify efforts to hopefully have a better path towards protecting the park. Unfortunately, there are elements that still aren't working, as the decision of the World Heritage Committee this summer clearly highlighted. Governance deficiencies domestically continue to hamper corrective actions, particularly around water governance. We do still see a trend where, on the one hand, Canada is working to correct issues with the park, but on the other hand, are continuing to take actions which undermine those efforts, like limiting oversight of oil sands projects. It's important to also note that the efforts that Mikisew has put into bringing forward the concerns around the park have been very resource intensive for a small community that has a number of other competing priorities. It has not been without consequence for Mikisew to put so much effort into making sure that the committee and advisory bodies are aware of the issues, and that's a heavy burden for a small community to bear. I would encourage all of you to read the decision from this summer from the World Heritage Committee, because it provides a very, very clear articulation of what is not working domestically with Canada, and where the momentum that has been built under the action plan needs to be increased and improved to have a better outcome for the park. In closing, I'd like to provide a few words of optimism. Mikisew is beginning to see a path forward for the park at this point, with a combination of the action plan, but also the most recent decision from the World Heritage Committee, which really highlights how barriers to corrective actions can be addressed, and where the state party needs to focus new and increased efforts to address those barriers. Thank you very much.